Imagine this. It's Valentine's Day, a night that should be filled with love, surprises, maybe even a little bit of magic. A night where everything seems right. But what if, instead of flowers and candles, you ended up in the grips of something far darker, far more dangerous than you could ever expect? This isn't some fictional tale you've heard 1,000 times. No, this is something that really happened. A true Valentine's Day story that will make you question everything about the people you trust and the reality around you. What if the person sitting across from you, the one you thought you knew so well, wasn't the person they seemed at all? You've probably had your own share of date night disasters, but have you ever wondered how quickly things can go from perfect to terrifying? What would you do if your Valentine's turned into your worst nightmare? I'm about to tell you the true story of one such night, a night where a seemingly innocent date would unravel into something far more chilling. Are you ready to hear the horrifying truth? Because when it's over, you might never look at love or the people around you the same way again. But first, let me know in the comments, what's the worst Valentine's Day you've ever had? Have you ever had a feeling that something just wasn't right? Hold that thought, because this one will leave you questioning every detail. Stay with me, the story is just beginning. The evening started like any other romantic night. Jason had arrived with a bouquet of roses, their delicate petals wrapped in satin. The flowers, so vibrant, almost seemed out of place in the dimly lit room, their scent lingering in the air like the promise of something beautiful. Ella smiled, feeling her heart race with excitement. She had no idea that something far more unsettling was just beginning to unfurl beneath the surface. They exchanged pleasantries, Jason's charm working effortlessly as they settled into their corner booth. The restaurant was warm, cozy, a place filled with quiet laughter and the soft clink of glasses. For a moment, Ella felt at ease, lost in the comfort of the night. The candles flickered between them, casting dancing shadows across their faces. Jason poured her a glass of red wine, his hand steady, his eyes never leaving hers. Everything seemed perfect. The conversation flowed naturally at first. They talked about their childhoods, their favorite movies, what they wanted from life. Jason listened intently, nodding, smiling as if he hung on every word. Ella felt as though she was falling deeper into this warm, safe place. She was happy, genuinely happy. But then, little by little, the cracks began to show. Jason's smile lingered too long, his gaze shifting from affectionate to almost calculating. It wasn't obvious at first, but there was something in the way his eyes locked onto hers, something too focused, almost as though he was studying her, dissecting her every reaction, memorizing her words, her expressions. Ella didn't understand why, but it made her skin crawl. Then the first odd thing happened, a missed call. Jason's phone vibrated on the table, its screen flashing brightly in the otherwise dim setting. The name on the display was familiar, yet it caught Ella's attention. Laura, it read, the same name he had mentioned a few weeks ago. A friend, he had said, no big deal. But the second time the phone rang, and he hesitated for just a beat before dismissing it, that odd feeling returned. Ella tried to brush it off. Maybe he was just distracted. After all, the night was still young, and everything had started off so perfectly. But the call didn't stop. Another vibration, another ring. Jason's eyes flicked to the screen, then back to Ella, his smile faltering for just a moment. He cleared his throat, excusing himself to take a quick call. As he stepped away, Ella's mind started racing. She hadn't seen him act this way before. He was always so calm, so in control. When he returned, his demeanor had changed. His movements were slower, more deliberate, like he was pulling back into himself. The conversation was stilted now, as though there was a wall between them that hadn't been there just moments ago. Ella could feel it, the change in the air, like a sudden drop in temperature, but she couldn't quite explain why. It wasn't just that Jason seemed distant. It was the way his eyes no longer shone with affection. Now they seemed cold, distant, almost predatory. She could sense it, the shift, like a strange energy that had entered the room without her realizing it. She shook her head, trying to ignore it. It had to be in her mind, right? Maybe she was reading too much into it. But then there was another thing. Jason's hand, which had been resting on the table, started to fidget. He tapped his fingers rapidly on the edge of the glass. The rhythmic sound was almost mechanical, too deliberate, too steady. It was unnerving. Ella looked at him, searching his face, trying to find the man she had shared so many good moments with. But this wasn't him. "Are you okay?" Ella asked, her voice breaking through the silence. Jason looked up at her, and for a brief second, there was something dark, flickering in his eyes. Then just as quickly he smiled and nodded. "I'm fine," he said, but there was a slight tremor in his voice, a tightness she hadn't noticed before. "Just tired, I guess. It's been a long day." But Ella didn't believe him, not anymore. She wanted to ask more, to push for answers, but something stopped her. Maybe it was the wine, maybe it was the atmosphere. But Ella couldn't shake the feeling that if she asked too many questions, the delicate balance of the night would shatter. So instead she played along, letting the unease sit in her chest like a growing weight. The night dragged on, the conversation fizzling out into awkward silence. Jason's phone vibrated again, but this time he didn't make an attempt to hide it. He let the call ring through, staring at the screen with a faraway look in his eyes. His fingers twitched as if itching to pick it up, but he didn't. He just let it ring. "Jason?" Ella's voice trembled this time, the tension thickening between them. "Are you sure everything's okay?" Jason finally looked at her, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, he didn't speak. And then, in a voice softer than before, he simply said, "You'll be fine." That's when Ella felt it, the chill, a feeling she couldn't explain, a sudden coldness that crept into her bones and wrapped itself around her heart. It wasn't the room, the storm outside, or even the wine. No, it was something else. She could feel her pulse quicken, her throat tightening as she tried to make sense of the words, the behavior, the way everything had shifted. Ever had that moment when you realized someone you thought you knew so well suddenly became a stranger? Ella felt it then. She was no longer sitting across from the man she had trusted. No, she was sitting across from someone else, someone she didn't recognize. And what was worse, she didn't know if he even cared if she knew. The clock ticked louder in her mind, the second hand creeping closer to a breaking point. Something was about to happen, something Ella couldn't have prepared for. The question burned in her mind. Was it all just a coincidence? Or was there something far darker going on behind Jason's eyes? The night was no longer about love. It had become something far more unsettling, something far more dangerous, and Ella was about to find out just how wrong she had been. The atmosphere in the restaurant had changed. It felt like the walls were closing in on Ella, though she couldn't quite place why. Her heart raced now, every beat echoing in her ears as she watched Jason. He hadn't looked at her once since he'd dismissed that last phone call. He was staring straight ahead, his eyes fixed on something. Someone Ella couldn't see. Her pulse quickened, the weight of the moment pressing down on her chest like a thick fog. Was he hiding something? She had known Jason for months, but tonight was different. There was a distance in his gaze, a coldness that sent shivers up her spine. The seconds stretched on like minutes. Then it happened. Jason's phone rang again, the harsh sound breaking through the heavy silence between them. Ella glanced at the screen. Lara, again. Lara? Why hadn't he answered? Why had he been dodging these calls all night? Her thoughts were interrupted when Jason slid his phone across the table. It was almost as if he were offering it to her, his gaze locking with hers, steady, unblinking. "Answer it," he said, his voice too calm, too controlled. "She's been trying to reach me all night." Ella's stomach twisted into knots. This wasn't normal. Something about the way Jason said those words felt wrong. She hesitated, staring at the phone. The name Lara flashed again, almost mocking her. But before she could say anything, Jason reached for his coat, standing up suddenly and muttering, "I'll be right back." He left before Ella could protest, leaving her alone at the table, with the phone sitting on the edge of the table, its screen glowing in the dim light like a warning. Ella sat frozen, staring at the phone. The seconds stretched on like hours, each tick of the clock sounding impossibly loud. She felt her fingers move involuntarily toward it, and before she could stop herself, she picked it up. Her fingers brushed across the screen. She wasn't sure why, but she felt the need to know, to understand. Lara. Ella's heart raced. She felt the hair on the back of her neck rise, a sense of danger creeping over her skin. She clicked on the call log. There it was, dozens of missed calls, all from Lara, stretching back for days, even weeks. Suddenly, a new message notification appeared. Ella's breath caught in her throat as she read the message aloud, her voice trembling. "He's not who you think he is." Her hands went cold. Her heart thudded in her chest, drowning out the noise of the restaurant around her. What did that mean? Before she could even process the words, her phone buzzed in her hand. Another message. This one was different. He's watching you. Ella's pulse began to race. What was going on? What was Jason involved in? The room seemed to darken around her as she frantically scanned the phone for more messages. Her mind was spinning, but she couldn't make sense of anything. As she was about to text back, there was a sharp sound. The door to the restaurant opened. Jason returned to the table, but something was different. He was no longer the man she had been talking to. His movements were stiff, mechanical. His eyes, cold. He didn't even glance at her as he sat down, the air between them now thick with tension. Ella opened her mouth to speak, but her voice was caught in her throat. There was no denying it now. Something had gone terribly wrong. She wanted to ask about the texts. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, but the words wouldn't come. She felt paralyzed, trapped by an invisible force. Jason reached for his glass of wine, still avoiding her gaze. His fingers trembled slightly as he took a sip, but it was the strange, unreadable smile that appeared on his lips that made Ella's skin crawl. "You should go," he said softly, his voice almost too calm. "It's late, and I don't think we should see each other again." The words hit her like a slap across the face. The way he said it, so casually, so matter-of-factly, sent a cold wave of terror washing over her. It was as if he had been waiting for this moment, for her to ask the wrong question. "What do you mean?" she managed to ask, her voice barely a whisper. Jason's smile didn't waver. He didn't answer right away, letting the silence stretch on until Ella felt as though the air itself was suffocating her. Then his voice, low and deliberate, cut through the tension. "I'm sorry you had to find out this way." The next few moments felt like a blur. Ella stood up, her legs shaky, her mind racing. She had to get out of there. She had to leave. But as she moved toward the door, something made her pause. She felt it, a presence. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up and she turned, expecting to see Jason standing behind her. But instead, there was a shadow in the corner of the room. It was a man just standing there watching her. He wasn't looking at Jason. He was looking at her. His expression was hidden in the darkness, but Ella felt his gaze like a weight on her chest. Her pulse pounded in her ears. Who was that? How long had he been watching? Her eyes flicked back to Jason, but he wasn't paying attention. He was still smiling, sipping his wine, as if everything were normal, but Ella knew deep down it wasn't. The man in the corner shifted, moving toward her, and in that moment everything snapped into place. The missed calls, the cryptic messages, Jason's strange behavior. She was not safe. Jason's voice was calm, too calm. "It's time for you to go." But Ella couldn't move. Fear held her in place, like invisible chains. What would she do? How could she escape? The figure in the corner was getting closer. And for the first time, Ella realized that Jason wasn't just a part of this nightmare. He was the cause of it. What would you do if you were stuck in a situation like this? If the person you trusted most suddenly turned into a stranger, a threat? Ella's mind raced, searching for an escape, but the walls felt like they were closing in on her, and Jason's eyes, those eyes, were now completely devoid of any warmth, any recognition. He wasn't the man she thought he was. Not at all. The question lingered in the air, unspoken, as the shadow grew closer. Would she make it out of this night alive? The figure in the corner of the restaurant was no longer just a vague shape. Ella could now make out the details. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark jacket that blended into the shadows. His face remained hidden, but the feeling of being watched was suffocating. The air was thick with tension. Ella couldn't breathe. She turned her head slowly, her eyes darting back to Jason, but he was still sitting at the table, his face calm, too calm, like this was all part of the plan. Had he been planning this the whole time? A soft laugh escaped from Jason's lips, breaking the silence. "Isn't it beautiful?" he said. His voice was smooth, too smooth, but there was something sharp behind it now, a dark edge that made Ella's stomach twist. "You finally get to see the real me." Her throat went dry. Ella's legs felt like lead, her feet glued to the ground as the figure stepped closer. She instinctively backed away, her breath quickening, but there was nowhere to go. The door was across the room, too far for comfort. The corner was closing in on her, and with each step, the shadowy figure moved closer, its intent unmistakable. It was at that moment, the moment when Ella truly understood. This wasn't a date. This was a trap. Jason's smile grew wider, colder. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes flickering to the figure now standing just a few feet away from Ella. She turned her head, her heart pounding in her chest, and saw him more clearly now. a man in his late 30s with disheveled hair and a scar running down his cheek. His eyes were wild, wide, unblinking, and terrifying. He was staring at her as if she were prey. And that's when the truth hit her like a slap to the face. This wasn't a stranger. This wasn't a random person at all. This was Lara. The man, Lara's ex, Jason's obsession, was the one who had been watching her. Not just tonight, but for weeks. It was him who had been sending the cryptic messages, the eerie texts warning her about Jason. It was him who had been lurking in the background, waiting for his moment to intervene. And now, he was here. Jason's voice broke through her stunned silence. You don't know how much I've had to sacrifice for this, Ella. How many years I've waited for this moment. All for you. Ella's mind scrambled for answers, for some way out. But the horror of it all was closing in. This wasn't just a broken relationship or a jealous ex. This was obsession. This was madness. Before she could process another thought, Lara's ex, his name was Tyler, took a step toward her, his hand reaching out, and she instinctively took a step back, bumping into the back of the booth. He wasn't going to let her escape. Jason stood slowly, still wearing that smile, as though this was all a game, something to be savored. He seemed to enjoy watching her panic, his cold, calculating eyes fixed on her. You see, Ella, Jason continued, standing to his full height, his voice smooth as glass. I did all of this for you. Tyler's hand reached out for her arm with a speed that made her flinch. His grip was firm, unyielding. Ella gasped as he yanked her toward him, his breath hot and stale on her face. She struggled, but his strength was overpowering. And Jason, instead of helping, just watched, eyes glinting with an almost affectionate satisfaction. Tyler's grip tightened, his fingers digging into her skin. His face was so close now, the stench of alcohol on his breath. I told you, Ella, he hissed. Jason would always get what he wanted. And he wanted you all along, but you weren't supposed to find out. Ella's heart thundered in her chest, the reality of what she was hearing finally sinking in. This wasn't just a romantic gesture gone wrong. This was a trap set by two people who were so obsessed with her that they were willing to destroy everything in their path to possess her. Tyler's eyes burned with intensity as he spoke, the words dripping from his mouth like venom. Don't you see? We were meant to be together, Ella. All three of us, you, Jason, and me, forever. He laughed darkly, but the sound was so empty, so void of warmth that it made Ella's stomach churn. In that moment, everything clicked. Jason had never cared for her. He had never seen her as a person, as someone he could love. She was just a prize, something to win, to possess. Tyler had been the one to help orchestrate it all. Ella's blood ran cold as she realized the truth. This wasn't just about love, this was about control. The room around her felt like it was closing in, the walls tightening. There was no escape. She had walked into a nightmare that she couldn't wake up from. What lengths would someone go to for love? Was this love? Or was it obsession? Something so twisted and dangerous that it could only lead to destruction. Jason moved closer now, his eyes still fixed on her. The sight of him, standing there with the same blank, satisfied expression, made her stomach turn. Tyler's hand was still on her arm, dragging her closer to him as if she were a prize, a trophy to be fought over. Ella could feel the panic rising in her chest. Was she going to die here? Was she going to be trapped in this nightmare forever? Please, Jason, Ella whispered, her voice barely audible. Let me go. But Jason just smiled. You don't understand, do you? He said, his voice low and almost gentle. You were never meant to leave. Tyler laughed again, the sound sending a chill down her spine. It's too late for that. You can't leave us now, Ella. Not after everything we've done. The air felt suffocating as Jason and Tyler slowly advanced on her, closing the distance with deliberate slowness. She had no choice now. The restaurant was empty, the staff nowhere to be found. She was trapped. A panic-fueled surge of adrenaline shot through her body. She had to get out. Without thinking, she broke free of Tyler's grip, shoving him back with all her strength. He stumbled, surprised by her sudden move, but Ella didn't wait to see if he would come after her. She dashed for the door, heart pounding in her chest. As she raced out into the stormy night, her only thought was escape. Behind her, she could hear Jason's cold laughter, echoing through the restaurant, but Ella didn't dare look back. She ran as fast as she could, the sound of footsteps following close behind her, like a nightmare that would never end. What would you do if you found yourself trapped in a nightmare like this? Would you be able to escape? Would you survive? Ella's heart thundered in her chest as she burst out of the restaurant, the door slamming behind her with a deafening crack. The cold night air hit her like a slap in the face, but it wasn't enough to clear the fog of terror clouding her mind. She could hear them, Jason and Tyler, shouting behind her, the sound of their footsteps growing louder as they chased her into the night. Her breath came in sharp, panicked gasps as she sprinted down the slick sidewalk, her shoes slipping on the wet pavement. The storm hadn't let up, and the wind howled through the trees, the rain coming down in sheets that blurred her vision. But she couldn't stop. She couldn't let them catch her. Could she outrun them? Could she survive? She didn't know. All she knew was that she had to try. Every step felt heavier, the pounding in her chest so loud it nearly drowned out everything else. Her mind raced. She couldn't go back to the restaurant. She couldn't go to her apartment. It wasn't safe. She was being hunted. There was no one on the street, no one to help, only the dark figures of Jason and Tyler getting closer. Ella looked around frantically, her mind screaming for an escape. What was she supposed to do? Then ahead, she saw it. A narrow alley, dimly lit but offering a sliver of hope. She veered off the sidewalk, making a desperate run toward it. The alley was dark, barely wide enough for her to squeeze through, but it was better than nothing. Her feet stumbled as she ran, and a sharp pain shot up her leg when she stepped wrong, but she pushed through it, determined to stay ahead. Behind her, the sound of footsteps grew louder, closer, and then another scream. Tyler. He was shouting something, but she couldn't make out the words. She didn't care. She didn't need to know. All she cared about was getting as far away from them as possible. She turned the corner of the alley and paused for just a second, gasping for breath, trying to steady herself. Her eyes scanned the area ahead, looking for some kind of exit, some kind of chance to escape. Suddenly, the silence of the alley was broken by the sound of something heavy hitting the ground, the thud of boots against wet pavement. They were getting closer, too close. Ella turned sharply, looking for a way out, but then she saw it. A fire escape. Her pulse quickened. She could climb it. It was her only shot. She ran toward the rusted metal ladder, grabbing onto the first rung. Her fingers were numb from the cold, but she didn't hesitate. She pulled herself up, her heart pounding louder with each step. Behind her, the footsteps grew louder, closer, and she could hear Tyler's voice now, sharp and jagged. "You can't hide, Ella." But she didn't look back. She couldn't. The fire escape was her only chance. Halfway up, Ella's foot slipped, and she let out a strangled cry as she nearly lost her balance. She dangled for a moment, gripping the cold metal with all her strength, feeling the panic rising in her chest. This was it. If she fell, they would catch her. If they caught her, it was over. The thought paralyzed her for a moment, but she forced herself to keep climbing. She had no choice. With a final, desperate heave, she pulled herself onto the rooftop. She collapsed onto the cold surface, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she scrambled to her feet. She was safe, for now, but the nightmare wasn't over. She could hear them below her, still calling out her name, but it was more like a growl now, filled with rage and frustration. Jason's voice cracked through the dark. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be, Ella." Ella swallowed hard, pressing herself flat against the cold concrete of the rooftop, trying to make herself as small as possible. Her eyes darted across the rooftops, looking for another escape, a way out. But there was nothing, only dark shadows and empty streets, the city stretching out beneath her like an endless abyss. She heard Tyler again, his voice muffled by the wind, but she could make out the words clearly. "I told you, Ella, you belong to us. You're not getting away." Ella's chest tightened, her breath caught in her throat. This wasn't just a chase anymore. This was a game to them. For a moment, everything was still. The wind howled, and she could hear the distant sound of traffic in the distance, but there was nothing else. No footsteps, no shouting, nothing. Had they given up? Had they left? She dared to look over the edge of the rooftop, her heart pounding in her chest. And there, standing in the shadows beneath the fire escape, was Jason. His eyes locked onto hers, cold and predatory. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to make Ella's blood run cold. They weren't leaving. Jason took a step back, disappearing into the dark. But Ella knew he wasn't gone. He was waiting for her. They both were. Her body screamed at her to move, to run, to do something, anything. But the rooftop was a dead end. She had nowhere else to go. Then a noise from behind. She whirled around, eyes wide with fear. Tyler. He had somehow made his way up another fire escape, sneaking up behind her. She had been so focused on Jason that she hadn't seen him, and now he was standing there grinning, eyes gleaming with that same predatory hunger. Ella backed away instinctively, her heart slamming against her ribs. But there was nowhere to retreat. The rooftop was small, the space closing in, the feeling of being trapped more suffocating with every second. Tyler laughed, low and dark. "It's over, Ella. You think you can run?" He took another step closer, and she could hear the sound of his boots scraping against the metal. "We've been planning this for so long. You can't escape now." For a moment, Ella thought she was done for. Was this the end? Would she be dragged back down into their twisted game of obsession? Then, something unexpected happened. Ella whipped around to see a figure leap onto the rooftop, sliding down the edge of the building. It was a stranger, someone who had seen her from the street and rushed up to help, but Ella didn't know who they were or why they'd come. The person's hand shot out, grabbing her arm just as Tyler lunged toward her. There was no time to think, no time to hesitate. This was her chance. The stranger yanked Ella away from Tyler, pulling her toward the edge of the rooftop, and for the first time since the nightmare had begun, Ella felt a sliver of hope. They sprinted toward the other side, and with no time to lose, Ella climbed over the edge of the building, her body aching from the sheer adrenaline. She jumped. She hit the ground hard, but the stranger caught her, guiding her into the alley below. They were out, for now, but the sound of Tyler's scream echoed from the rooftop, and Jason's twisted laugh filled the night. Ella's mind raced. Had she escaped? Was it over? She had survived. But the night had cost her. She wasn't the same. And she would never forget what she had learned, what obsession could do when taken too far. What's the scariest part of a Valentine's Day date gone wrong? Ella learned it wasn't the flowers, the dinner, or the romance. It was the terror of realizing you were never safe, not even with someone you thought you knew. It was over, or so she thought. Ella didn't know how long she had been running through the maze of alleyways, the sharp sting of the cold air cutting through her skin, her feet stumbling as she tried to keep pace with the stranger who had pulled her to safety. She didn't even know where she was anymore. Her mind was a blur of images, the flashing light of Jason's cold smile, Tyler's wild, hungry eyes, and the crash of the window as her last chance for survival was shattered. The stranger, whoever they were, had helped her escape, but the cost was high. Ella's legs shook with exhaustion, her body sore from the frantic escape. She could barely remember the details of the chase, only flashes of the terror, the feeling of being watched, of being cornered. It wasn't until they reached a small, dimly lit apartment that Ella allowed herself to stop and breathe. The stranger, a man in his late 20s with scruffy dark hair and a tired, weathered look in his eyes, led her inside. "I'll call the police," he said in a quiet voice, his accent thick with fatigue. "But you need to stay here. Stay hidden. They're not going to give up." Ella barely nodded, her hands shaking as she gripped her coat tighter around her. She wanted to speak, to ask him who he was, why he helped her, but the words wouldn't come. The terror still gripped her throat, and the memory of the rooftop, of the dark figures chasing her, loomed like a shadow in her mind. The stranger moved to the phone, dialing quickly, his eyes never leaving her. As the phone rang, Ella's gaze wandered to the window, the curtain drawn tight, but she felt exposed, vulnerable. Was Jason out there? Was Tyler waiting just around the corner? She forced herself to look away. It wasn't the time to think about that. She had to focus on surviving, on what was next. The stranger spoke in hushed tones into the phone, the conversation quick and low. He was alert, efficient, but Ella couldn't focus on his words. Instead, she thought of the life she had left behind, her apartment, her job, her friends, all of it feeling like another world. Could she go back to any of that now? Could she ever feel safe again? The call ended, and the stranger turned to her. "The cops are on their way. They'll be here soon, but..." He paused, glancing at the door, as if expecting someone to burst through at any moment. "You need to know something. They'll come after you again." Ella stared at him, confused. "Who? Jason? Tyler?" He nodded. "Both. They're obsessed. They won't stop, not unless they get what they want. You're the prize." Ella swallowed hard, her throat tight with emotion. She felt a cold wave of dread wash over her. What had she walked into? What had she unknowingly become part of? The stranger moved closer, his eyes softening just slightly. "Listen, you're not the first to fall victim to this. There have been others. Jason's obsession with you, it's not new. He's been doing this for years. I've seen it before. He does this. He takes what he wants, and when he's done, when he has you, there's no escaping. But you got lucky tonight. Her breath caught in her throat. Lucky? Was this what lucky looked like? Her mind reeled as the enormity of it all began to sink in. Jason had planned this. He had been watching her for months. No, longer. Her life had never been her own. The stranger paused, as if weighing his next words carefully. You have to understand, Jason isn't like other men. He's calculated, ruthless. He'll use anyone to get to you. And Tyler, he trailed off, shaking his head. Tyler's just as bad. They'll never let you go. No matter how far you run, they'll find you. For the first time, Ella felt the full weight of what she had survived. Not just an obsessed ex or a twisted date. This was something deeper, something darker. She had been part of a game, an obsession so deep that it didn't just ruin relationships, it destroyed lives. The silence in the room felt suffocating now, the air thick with unspoken truths. Ella's eyes darted toward the door. Would they come for her? Would they track her down again? The stranger saw the fear in her eyes and stepped closer. I know you're scared. I get it. But you can't run forever. Not from them. The words echoed in her mind. You can't run forever. What did he mean? Was she trapped? Always looking over her shoulder? Always wondering if today would be the day they found her? Would she always feel their eyes on her, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the moment to strike? The stranger froze, his eyes narrowing. Without another word, he moved toward the door, his hand hovering over the handle. Ella's breath caught in her throat as he slowly opened it. Outside, a uniformed police officer stood in the doorway, his face grim but determined. We've got your back. We'll handle it from here. But even as the officer entered, Ella's heart didn't settle. Would the police be enough? Would they be able to protect her from Jason and Tyler? Or were they already too deep into the shadows? The idea that someone was always watching her, always waiting, gnawed at her insides like a slow burn. The stranger stepped aside to let the officer in, but before the officer could say anything else, the door slammed shut behind him. The fear was still there, hanging in the air, thick as fog. The room felt smaller, the walls pressing in, and Ella knew that even though she had survived the night, she was far from safe. Days passed, but Ella couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still watching her. The police couldn't find Jason or Tyler. The search was ongoing, but it was clear now. They were hiding, biding their time, waiting for her to slip up, waiting for her to let her guard down. Her once quiet life had been shattered. She couldn't return to her apartment, couldn't go back to work, couldn't even visit the places she loved without feeling their eyes on her. What would you do if you found out you were being watched on Valentine's Day? Would you ever feel safe again? Could you ever go back to living a normal life, knowing that someone had been stalking you, planning this all along? For Ella, the answer was clear. No, she would never be the same. Not after what happened, not after the nightmare that started with a simple date, the nightmare that would haunt her for the rest of her life. They were still out there, Jason, Tyler, and the twisted, unrelenting obsession that kept them in the shadows, waiting. And Ella would never escape that, not entirely. As the days turned into weeks, Ella tried to piece her life back together, but some things, some fears, never fade. The feeling of being watched, of being hunted, never left her. The shadows still lingered, and though she survived that night, she knew that the nightmare would follow her forever. So next time you hear the knock of a door, or the buzz of a phone that just won't stop ringing, ask yourself, what's lurking in the darkness? What's hiding behind the mask of a Valentine's Day date? Because you never really know who you're sharing the night with. And sometimes love isn't the only thing that's on the menu. What's out there waiting for you? If you've had a creepy Valentine's Day experience, or maybe you've felt that strange, unsettling energy around someone before, share it with us in the comments. Who knows what's lurking around the corner on the most romantic day of the year? Stay safe and remember, sometimes the most terrifying things come in the form of a rose and a smile. If you enjoy gripping horror stories, make sure to hit that subscribe button now and turn on the bell icon and join us for more haunting tales that will send shivers down your spine. New stories every week.